Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Honest Conversations. I'm Katelyn Brewer, President and CEO of Darkness to Light, and it is a pleasure to be back after a little bit of a summer hiatus with our next Honest Conversations. I want to see everybody where you're from, why you're here. So if you can make sure that you add your name and your location in the chat, what you're interested in hearing about today, just go ahead and welcome everybody. Wonderful. So what is Honest Conversations? For most of you, Honest Conversations might be a new thing. And the reality is we've been doing it for just over a year now at Darkness to Light. And it is a series for us to have a chance to talk openly and honestly, one, about the difficulty of child sexual abuse in society in general, but more specifically for often historically marginalized and stigmatized communities within the United States. Previously, we've chatted to Hispanic and Latino and Latinas. We've talked to the Black community. We've talked about LGBTQ+, the Jewish Orthodox community. And today, I have the pleasure of having two individuals who are experts in child sexual abuse prevention within the Native and Indigenous communities here in the United States. So before I introduce my two incredible guests, we're just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping for the webinar today. So just so you know, if you're on Zoom, all participants are muted. And if you have any questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function in the Zoom or the comments if you're on Facebook. Welcome to everybody on Facebook. Please put those comments in the comment section, and my team, who are amazing, will get those questions to me so we can ask those at the end. And the chat is for networking and comments. So again, please add where you're from, why you've joined us today, and introduce yourself. Where do you work? You know, it's really important for us to all sort of create that community of those who are interested in building the foundation for those to speak on. I want everybody else to know that this is also a safe space. Some of the things that we might talk about today could be triggering, and please don't hesitate to log off if you are triggered. But if you need to talk to someone, please call 1-866-4-LIGHT. Or you can text the word light to 741-741. And I know that my team will be putting that information in the chat on a regular basis. And for those of you who are looking to have this shared with your friends, it will be available on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel, and we do also have an Honest Conversations website page on d2l.org. We do have Spanish translation for all of our Honest Conversations. Just be sure to give us a couple days to get that translation. And in the meantime, follow us on your favorite social media platform. All right, that's it. That's housekeeping. Now my team's happy with me. Let's get into the good stuff. So today, as I mentioned, we have two amazing individuals here as we celebrate National Native American Heritage Month. And they are here to talk to us about protecting Indigenous children from sexual abuse, particularly in the Native American community. They have a rich history and culture and traditions and social connections in those communities, but unfortunately a history of experiencing abuse and oppression at the hands of others at a much higher rate. And so today we're going to discuss the unique challenges that are facing the Native American community and how organizations, both within those communities and external to those communities, can partner with the Native American group to find solutions that work. And so I would love to start off with some personal introductions. So Dr. Hallman, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off today and introducing yourself, where you work, and what your specialty is.
Great, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's a really special day and a special month, obviously. So happy that we have Native American Heritage Month, finally. There was a day I remember when we did not. My name is Kelly Hallman. I'm the founder and director of the Indigenous Adolescent Girls Empowerment Network, or IMAGEN is the acronym we use. I'm originally from Oklahoma. I'm from Northeast Oklahoma. I went to school in 35 different states before I was 12 years old. My father was a construction worker, and so I was all around everywhere. As a child, I went to school in Flagstaff, Arizona. I got my BA there. I went to graduate school at Michigan State, and for the last 25 years, I've been working internationally on evaluating and strengthening programs to improve the health, well-being, and improve the rights of women and children around the world. For the past decade, I have shifted my focus, however, to bring my international experience to bear on Native American communities within the US. So that's who I am.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your work. We're going to have to chat more about your international work. I'm so intrigued. And Kimee, please, I would love for you to introduce yourself.
Yes, Jay, Sango, Kimee Wind-Hummingbird, Jahojifkados. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion today. Again, my name is Kimee Wind-Hummingbird, and I'm Muscogee, and I'm joining you today from my reservation in Oklahoma, where I've lived my entire life, with the exception of when I left for college. But I didn't venture far, and I remained in Oklahoma. So Kelly and I have two very different experiences. It sounds like I'm so excited to hear more about hers today. I began in Indian Child Welfare in 1999, working for the Cherokee Nation Indian Child Welfare Program, and left there in 2013 to join the Muscogee Nation Children and Family Services Administration. I resigned as the Director of Children and Family Services position and joined the amazing team at the National Native Children's Trauma Center about 6 months ago. So I'm their newest member and excited to be a part of their team. My 22 years of working in Indian child welfare began as a boots on the ground worker, serving families involved in the court system. Since that time, I've done work in foster care, adoption and certification, diligent search for relatives. I've written policy and procedures, developed and implemented new programs, all with a family focus, working to ensure that we meet the family where they are to provide them with the culturally appropriate services to meet their needs. On a personal note, I'm a mother to 3 amazing young women who continue to make me proud on a daily basis, and a kiki to 2 of the best granddaughters I could have ever dreamed of. They're truly gifts, and spending time with them really renews my drive to work with Indian families. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
It's such a pleasure. I love that, a kiki. My Nana is one of the most amazing people to me, and it's fun to always hear the different names for grandmothers. They're such special people. So I want to jump right in. We don't have a ton of time today, and I know there's a lot for people to learn. And so, Dr. Hallman, I'm going to go back to you. And as I was learning more about the work that IMAGEN does, I was struck by the statistics. I mentioned a few of them earlier that you share at IMAGEN. Native youth are experiencing higher rates of abuse, as well as higher rates of some of the consequences that we know are linked to abuse, like teen pregnancy and substance abuse, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, unlike in the international realm where I, again, worked for a long time, in Native American communities, there's actually very little funding. The funding for programs is often very short in duration. The awards, the programs that are funded are often focused on putting out fires. Basically, there's a service maybe, or counseling or something available after bad things happen, but there's really not that much on primary or secondary prevention that focuses on the upstream stuff. And we know that given historical trauma and a lot of the things that our communities have experienced, there's a lot of upstream work that needs to be done, and it needs to be done by the people in Native communities so that it's Native led, it's Native design, it's sovereignly determined. For instance, at IMAGEN, what we try to focus on is really trying to renew those social structures that were there, particularly before colonial forces came, and really saw maternal power and women controlling things as quite threatening and very different from what they were used to. And so we really try and establish these platforms that are, in essence, Native social spaces and structures that are intergenerational in nature. It's grandmothers, mothers, aunties, really doing the collective mentoring of girls and young women. And there's a lot of intergenerational exchange of knowledge, of resources. And it's not just from the older to the younger, it's also from the younger to the older too, in terms of, learning about technology. A lot of grandmothers and mothers were not able to learn about their culture. And we have instances of girls, teaching their grandmothers how to construct a dance shawl, how to do things that they were deprived of because they went to boarding school, or their families denied that they were Native. And so that's basically what we try to do at IMAGEN, and acknowledge the bad things and the abuse and the discrimination that's still there, but really build upon the strengths of Native communities.
That's incredible. Where do you see in that intergenerational conversation, where do you see the genesis of the child sexual abuse prevention working? Do you see that it's majority the older generation that you spoke of, or does that genesis sort of start from the younger generation?
So in my experience, whenever you talk about child sexual abuse, the thing that immediately comes to mind for Native people is the boarding school era, because during the boarding school era, people were ripped from their families. Basically, any sort of language, cultural practice, any sort of acknowledgement of being Native was forcibly removed, beaten out of people, essentially. My grandfather went to school at an Indian boarding school in New Mexico, and his memories of the abuse to himself, his brother, the other children there, I feel as if I still carry those every day, and it really, drives and inspires the work that I do. But really, it's the boarding school area is what you'll hear, because people had their parenting skills and practices taken away from them, and they were never really replaced with certainly anything healthy, even if it was foreign. It was abuse at the hands of matrons and school directors. And so really that is what we believe the root of it is.
Thank you for that answer. Kimee, I want to bring you into the conversation, and Dr. Hallman speaks a lot about statistics and spoke a lot about statistics, and data collection is a worldwide issue when we're talking about child sexual abuse, but even more so in Native communities. And so, having served youth and families in tribal nations for many years, why do you think that is? What's the reason behind that?
Well, I'm fortunate that I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing Indian child welfare programs across Indian country, but also acknowledging the fact that there are 574 federally recognized tribes and a few hundred others that are state recognized. One thing that I know to be true is each program is vastly different, not better, not worse, just different. Each one is steeped in their own culture and customs and traditions that are specific only to them. And this is also reflective in their service delivery to their families. They are the experts within their communities, and they know best how to engage those families. Most of our traditions and stories are handed down orally within our families and communities. And in most cases, it's been uncommon for us to record these processes. I'm sure you can imagine, because there were so many governmental policies put in place to destroy us as nations and peoples, that we are cautious sharing about ourselves. And just like Kelly mentioned the boarding school era earlier too, I'd like to just briefly touch on that, about the fact that, our ancestors, some as young as 3 and 4 years old, were forcibly removed from their families and their communities. The only safety and love that they had ever known, to be sent to a school where the only objective was to strip them of everything they knew and who they were, their language, their traditions, their culture, their beliefs, their identities. General Pratt, who was the founder and superintendent of Carlisle Indian School, was known for ensuring every Indian child who entered his school was clear about one thing: the intent of his school and many others to instill the philosophy of, quote, "Let all that is Indian within you die. Kill the Indian and save the man." which is so very awful to even consider. But realistically, it's the absolute truth of what our relatives face. And looking at big picture, the only reason that Kelly and I are here today is because our ancestors endured. They found a way to be resilient. They faced an abuse I cannot even imagine. Their strength, their perseverance, and their fight allowed us to be here with you today. So with all that in mind, for many, many years, we've had outsiders knocking on our doors telling us, trust us. We know what's best for your children. When in actuality, the invasion into our communities stripped us of our most valuable resource, our children. So looping that back around to your question, in my opinion, we have taken great caution to protect our children, and we released data very cautiously about them. Also, as I mentioned earlier, every program is vastly different, and the tools they use to capture data vary. The information one community feels is important to obtain may look different from one reservation to the other. While there may be some commonalities in specific data for grant reporting, such as for reports to the federal, Kelly talked earlier about some of the grants and how short they are, but there are some specific reporting requirements that they have to submit with that data. But, you know, as sovereign nations, they develop their own policies and procedures and practices within their Indian child welfare program. Voice and choice. They decide on the data collected for their children. So that's how a lot of them look at it.
Kimee, that was an incredible answer. And for those of you who are watching today and are unfamiliar with the boarding school generation, I do recommend that you do some research. It's an incredibly important and yet not talked about portion of our history, where, as Kimee mentioned, there was an incredible amount of erasure of Native American culture, social, societal traditions, and quite frankly, dignity. And so I definitely recommend that everyone look that up. Kimee, I do have one follow-on question, and Dr. Hallman, you might also have an opinion on this. Given what you've just described in terms of the fight to maintain, you know, control over your data, the rebounding, you know, in terms of culture, where does child sexual abuse even come into play in terms of an important conversation that you're having when you have what may feel like such other difficult conversations that need to be had?
Well, it's always at the forefront. Another thing that I know to be true, as vastly different as our programs are, the one thing, we will always come together for the protection of our children. Mm-hmm. And as a child welfare worker for many years, if there was ever a time that we needed to have conversations or work conjointly with other tribes, we would do that for the protection of our children. We put that's paramount to us. And that's not something that historically happened within our communities. Our children were precious gifts from the Creator. They were held within high regard. Our children, our elders were highly respected. It wasn't until outsiders came into our communities and recognized how lovingly we cared for our children and how lovingly we cared and communally brought our children up together. We raised our children together in a community. So this hasn't been something that's within our history for a long time. This is outside influence on our tribes.
Dr. Hallman, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so even to this day, Native children are removed from their families at higher rates than any other group in the US. And a lot of this is because of, state and sort of non-Native child welfare agencies not recognizing how, and as Kimee was describing, how Native communities raise their children. It's not just, the mother and the father, it's a whole range of people. It's, aunties, uncles, it's people who we call aunties and uncles that's not the same as, other communities, other cultures call them. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's also a lot of discrimination and judgment and a lot of laws that are basically stacked against Native people, and the protection of their children is not as easy or self-determined as it really should be. And so this is something that we're still fighting even, to this day.
Most certainly. I mean, systemic racism, even within the child welfare system, I think a lot of people have had a very difficult time understanding that that could be possible. I think there's a lot of people who look at that and say, well, they've gone into it with the right reasons and they have big hearts. And while that might be true, more than one thing can be true at a time. And so what you're describing, Dr. Hallman, is a very clear example of how systemic racism sort of sits within the national social welfare for children within this country. So Kimee, I just want to go back to you. We heard a little bit about Dr. Hallman's work at IMAGEN IMAGEN, excuse me. And so I just want to hear a little bit more about your work with the National Native Children's Trauma Center and what you do there.
Absolutely, and thank you for asking. The University of Montana's National Native Children's Trauma Center was established in 2007 as a Category 2 Treatment and Services Adaptation Center within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. We expanded on the previous work of the Montana Center for Childhood Trauma to reflect a new geographical scope. NNCTC provides training and technical assistance in trauma-informed interventions and universal trauma supports in child serving systems, including child welfare, juvenile justice, schools, and outpatient mental health. Since 2007, we continue to be a national leader in trauma-informed investigation and intervention in tribal communities. Our mission is to work in respectful partnerships with tribes to implement, adapt, evaluate, and disseminate trauma interventions to decrease the social, emotional, spiritual, and educational impact traumatic experiences have on American Indian and Alaska Native children. I'm very excited to be a part of the team and hear of the amazing impacts we have across Indian country whenever we meet. And if I could just add a little bit to something that Kelly was mentioning earlier, just about implicit bias. I mean, that just brings to mind. And whenever you get in Indian country, you'll find that there's a lot of stories. That's how we relate. There's always a story to tell. And it just reminds me of a story that a friend of mine told me several years back about there was a state child welfare worker and a tribal child welfare worker and local law enforcement that was not tribal law enforcement. And there was a call, there was a allegation of concern for the safety of the child in the home. The allegation was that it was unsafe living condition because there was, dead animal and blood and sharp knives and things within close proximity to the children. And just to give you the short version, the state child welfare worker, their recommendation was to remove the child because the children were she was concerned because whenever she showed up and they did this conjointly and they all arrived at the same time and they saw the entire, it played out together in front of them. But the state worker was like, there are sharp objects, there's a dead animal carcass, there's blood and gore everywhere. The local law enforcement was like, they've been on a hunt and they're harvesting an animal. And the tribal child welfare worker said, well, there was food everywhere. So just vastly different perspectives. And, he talked about how we don't, we honor animals, our four-legged relatives, whenever they provide for us, and we spare nothing. And there's a purpose for everything that we harvest from a deer. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It reminded me of that.
One of the best ways I know I learn is by story. I don't think that that's a story that I will ever forget. So thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. Dr. Hallman, I want to go back to you for a moment and talk about what, with some of the higher rates of abuse, I want to hear from you that how that manifests in adulthood. So when you think about adults that have trauma that's rooted in their childhoods, for Indigenous people, is that trauma different? For instance, the trauma that many have experienced being sent to boarding schools designed to sort of assimilate their American way of life. How has that impacted not just your identity, because I think that that's potentially clear, but the abuse that they experience in addition to not sort of being close with their identity?
Yeah, so I think the level of trauma and the level of sort of violent upheavals that many of our ancestors, our grandparents, parents, and even we as individuals today have experienced is it's much deeper and greater than I think a lot of people realize, and even some of us want to acknowledge. You know, before the boarding school era, there was relocation. We were forced from our ancestral lands. We were promised new lands in perpetuity as long as the water would run and the grass would grow. But, you know, shortly after the Civil War, you know, a lot of our lands got taken away in a process that was called allotment, where it was basically divided up and privatized. And a lot of it went to outsiders who were, you know, becoming more and more and just flooding into Native nations. Then the boarding school era happened. And then after that, there was relocation to urban areas. And all these things, every single one of them were to erase Native culture. You know, you can't be a hunter, you can't, you know, follow the buffalo or the deer or whatever. You have to be a farmer and sit in one place. You can't learn from your Native community like you used to. You have to go to this white or, you know, church-run school. You can't live with your Native community like you used to. You need to go to the city and find a job and not get very much help finding that job, but find one anyway, you know, be non-Native. And so it's just like over and over and over with every single generation, there's like one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. And a lot of people who are Native, we don't talk about this stuff because there's so much of it that it ends up so that there's a lot of unresolved grief and anger. You know, we haven't really had the chance to talk a lot about this. If we do, it's very painful. We often don't know how to deal with the pain and the trauma. And that's coupled on top of the discrimination, you know, the structural inequality, over-regulation of our communities. If you live in a tribal community, setting up a business takes 10 times more steps than it does to set up a business anywhere else. So it's that, it's also disinvestment in our communities. We can't access the resources that we're legally entitled to. By trading our lands, we were promised by the government basic child protection, basic health services, basic education services, and this trust responsibility is what that's called. The government has a trust responsibility to us, is often not met. And so it's like over and over and over again. And it's really, you know, you have to sort of take the positive that you can find and really start to build up on that, because it's really a case of feeling as if you're buried in quicksand and you're trying to dig out, right? And so it can be really rather daunting at times, I think. And, you know, with the child sexual abuse, it's all these frustrations that people and insults and humiliations that people have had over generations. And, you know, these terrible things happen. They're covered up, they're hidden. Sometimes it's outsiders doing this as well. And so it's just really difficult to have the services and the help that we need when we're not afforded the basic sort of things that the government is supposed to have been, you know, giving us for a long time.
Right, exactly. Kimee, I'd love to have you reflect on that as well.
Absolutely. So trauma-informed programs exist within our tribal communities. And sometimes when organizations hear of our services and our programs offered to support our families outside, you know, from the outside looking in, they consider our approaches to be cutting edge or, you know, just gold standard. You know, you hear that a lot, but it's when in fact we're really utilizing the guiding principles instilled within our communities and families since time immemorial. Right? Developing individualized services specific to each family with their input is ownership. There's ownership in that. When we develop our programs for our families, for the good of our community, we feel that responsibility to play our role in ensuring a healthy community and a safe living space. We are all often hand in hand with the families at ceremonies, sharing food, love, and celebrating them for their successes. Can that be challenging, working right next to, or, having ceremony right next to someone that you're working with? Absolutely, it can be. But tribal communities, because they can be small, and most often we know everyone or most people within them. We're very aware, and there are boundaries between child welfare workers and community members. And those boundaries are discussed early on with families, so there's no confusion as to the journey that they take together. And we know that children need supportive caregivers to help them heal from trauma. And many caregivers have their own trauma. Have their own trauma histories and related needs, which can impede their ability to support their own children. So in order to enhance children's resilience after trauma, it's essential to strengthen caregiver and family resilience as a whole. For reunification efforts to be successful, a parent needs to have support to overcome their past adversity, including their own trauma history, so they can develop a safe and healthy home environment for their child when they return. If you don't understand or address parent trauma, you can't truly create the well-being for the child or the family as a whole. And most tribes have taken this into consideration when developing practices to engage their families.
Muted myself, sorry, I got a little loud. We have a little train outside my office, and you were saying too many good things to hear the train. That's incredible. So talk to me then. We've had a lot of conversations in other communities around this idea of mental health. In a mainstream society right now, there's a lot of talk about going to therapy and what's your mental health and your self-care. And so what does that look like in your communities when you're building that resiliency? How do you advocate for each other and support each other when it comes to the mental health conversation?
Would you like to take that, or would I can tell you that it's always a challenge. It is, because unfortunately today there's still a big stigma around Western practices within our tribal communities. So we do actually, a lot of the services within the programs that I've seen promote tribal practices, as well as, if sometimes there may be a need to engage in other practices outside of the tribal community. But for the most part, again, there's a big stigma around even asking for help. So I think whenever it comes to child welfare programs in tribal communities, the way they can be successful in working and engaging with their families is doing that community outreach. So those community members, those citizens, and even those community stakeholders who aren't members of the tribe understand and recognize their programs and their systems, and know how to tap in and where to what services that are effective for that family. Dr. Hallman, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of talk about something that's a little more like ceremonial and collective, because, with so many things that have happened in our past, often it's not just, the unusual or, isolated person who is experiencing, a mental health issue. I think it's something that a lot of us do experience, don't recognize often. If we do have a problem, we may not, want to talk about it or admit it. And so I think these sort of collective ceremonial practices that Kimee and I have both mentioned, for the last 30 minutes or so, is something that Native people are really wanting to bring back more and strengthen. And in our girls-focused work, we do a lot of this. We want to have what we call a girl society in every community, so that it's basically 9 to 14, 15-year-old girls have a place where they can go every week and just do cultural activities, get together, talk, have fun, be safe. And then, the mentors of those groups are the ones who the girls begin to trust and to be recognized as confidants that girls can go to. And then it's more likely for them to be able to get the help they need when they have this established place they can always go. And if they don't feel like talking, they don't have to talk. It's not like one-on-one counseling, but they can be with somebody, they can be safe. And so those sort of structures, and these exist for adult women as well, these kind of talking circles. There are men's groups that are starting to emerge too, but basically trying to heal in a Native way and re-identify with our Native culture and identity is something I think that's going to do a lot to improve our mental health as individuals, but also as communities.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you for adding that. When we talk about perceptions of, Western world or even the U.S. government, I know, Kimee, we talked previously about the understanding of law enforcement and the justice system. So can you talk a little bit about the perception of law enforcement and the justice system within the tribal communities?
Sure. So while we have some amazing law enforcement agencies and top-notch judicial systems who are led by tribal citizens and considered national experts in their area of expertise, we haven't always had this Western view of law enforcement in courtrooms. Traditionally, tribal leaders made decisions about fairness and kept the balance within our systems. In some communities, that practice may look different today. From my experience, I was involved in many discussions the last few years about what it looked like in my community. While I worked for the Muscogee Nation, the United States Supreme Court issued their opinion on the McGirt case, which was a huge win for tribal sovereignty. The nation had a solid foundation to grow and support the change in practice within our community and with our partners across the state of Oklahoma. However, some immediate needs were noted. We didn't have a jail. In the past, we didn't have the need for a jail of our own. And I've come to learn that that's common within other tribal communities as well. While there may be a facility that's equipped to hold a few people on some reservations, there certainly aren't large prisons or huge jails and very few tribal juvenile detention centers. I've spoken today about the well-being of the community. That focus is generally at the forefront of tribal leadership. Many tribes are implementing or returning to restorative justice practices while surrounding the victim with tribally appropriate services to assist their healing and well-being. They also work with the offenders to find a new path within their community. One thing I found interesting in several conversations I've had over the years is the fact that in most languages, there's not a word that translates to justice or even goodbye. There was never a need for these words. Another interesting thought ran through my mind just last week. I heard a story from an elder, and any opportunity I get to listen, I absolutely take. They're national treasures, our elders, they're our language speakers, our wisdom keepers. And I guess something in him felt that I needed to hear this story, and he provided it. He related a time when his mother was on her deathbed and she was trying to describe the love that she had for him. She said in her first language, "You are the river that runs through me. I cannot live without you." Wow, that's pretty powerful. Not only is she describing the blood pumping through her veins to her heart and throughout her body or her love for her son, but she went on to say, "I will live on through you." She knew he would take what he learned from her and teach others as he has. While each community has a different story in a different language, there's an interconnectedness that we all share, that feeling of responsibility for community, for culture, and for the preservation of our traditions. The respect we have for our children, our elders, and everyone in between is imprinted on who we are as a people. Our tribal communities continue to thrive today because our citizens value each other, and we recognize that our continuation as sovereign nations is dependent upon each of us. We are absolutely distinct, different, and unique, and it's important to acknowledge that when working alongside tribes. If I could offer just one bit of advice, please take the time to learn about the tribe you're working with. Do the research so when you come to the table to engage with them, you'll have a foundational understanding of their programs, and that will make for a great start to your community partnership. But yes, so some of these practices are new to us. They're not something that we've had in place for hundreds of years. So we're finding our way, but I think us working together as communities, and the other side to that is if we, what it's my experience, if we need to learn a new approach, or we're hearing of something going on in another program in Indian community, you just pick up the phone and call them and reach out to them. There's a lot of peer-to-peer learning that goes along within Indian country, just learning what works on their reservation and see if things could be modified to work on ours.
Dr. Hallman, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on a couple things Kimee mentioned. The peer-to-peer is so crucial, and Native communities, Native people, tribes are really looking to learn from other Natives. They really don't want to have the kind of latest evidence-based practice that has been tested on a different culture and community, forced upon them. And so the real learning is between tribes. And that's one of the things we do within IMAGEN is we have these girl societies across Indian country, and every 2 weeks we have a supportive meeting so that all the mentors from those girl societies get together and they troubleshoot, they share what they're doing, they support each other. Those that are in the same state or geographic area start to really work together and have their own workshops independent of us. And so it's really something that we try and grow among Indian country communities. And I also wanted to pick up on the sort of restorative justice practices. There are a lot of what are referred to as healing to wellness courts now to deal with family disputes. And really, I think the thing that makes them different is, first of all, they recognize that the people involved are Native. If Native people are dealt with by other justice systems, first of all, they're not even recognized often as Native. They're often misclassified as white or Hispanic, and they're not even acknowledged as who they are. They also, the practices that are prevalent in those sort of systems are not healthy to anyone, in particular to Native people. And a lot of what these restorative justice programs are doing in Indian country is to really acknowledge not just those who are victims, but also people who are perpetrators, that there are Native perpetrators out there, and the reason they're perpetrators is because of all of this trauma and pain and lack of services. And it's really a kind of full circle that we try to do, and not just dealing with the problem that's emerged. We really try and dig into what are the underlying causes of those problems, intra-family stuff, perpetration, victim, you name it. We really try and look at the entire circle and really try and mend that hoop. In we have lots of terms that we use. We use a medicine wheel to talk about the balance of forces, and so it's really something we try to handle in a holistic manner to deal with the root causes of things.
I think that's incredibly important. I've had a few conversations with individuals who focus on what we term primary prevention. So how do you prevent the individual who might hurt the child from actually hurting the child? And what does that look like? And I think in mainstream society, that is not yet a comfortable conversation for most people. Most people are unwilling to look at the holistic form of prevention. It's, people often joke that you can commit murder and stay alive in prison, but if you hurt a child, if you're a child molester, you'll be murdered in prison. And so even in prison, you're not safe to go through reform and to, and so it's interesting. I think it's a conversation we have to have with ourselves in the prevention world in order to be able to fully address the problem and the issue that we have at hand. So I appreciate very much, Kimee, going back to you saying how innovative and gold standard, I think that you are ahead of the curve when it comes to addressing that. So I want to leave a little bit of time for some questions. I've seen some of those come through, but as we wrap up, before we take questions, I just want to hear from each of you one thing that you want to leave with parents, advocates, social workers. Who is what would you like to say to them if there's one thing they take away from this conversation today? And Kimee, I'll start with you.
Okay, excuse me. my thought is the importance of keeping children and families connected to their tribe, to their culture, to their customs, to their traditions. And that's something that Kelly and I both hit on earlier today, is the fact that our ancestors had that ripped from us, and it's taken us so many years to get not even a fraction of it back. We're not even close to being where we'd love to be. My children speak our language. I think that's important. I don't speak, I'm learning to speak, but I was bound and determined to ensure that my children spoke our language. And of course, my dream is that my children's children speak our language and their children speak our language. But I know that we're on a path to in the right direction to take back to give back what was ours, the language, with our culture, with our connections to our families. But if I could just offer that, and also I know that sometimes there is, again, I talked earlier about vastly different tribal child welfare programs and how they look differently, but please do everything you can to connect with that child's tribal child welfare program, or that child's tribe. That is, if I could leave you with that one thing, that's what I'd like to leave you with.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hallman?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, certainly keeping children within their families and culture is paramount, as Kimee said. I think to people who aren't Native, or maybe who don't directly work with Native people, just a couple words to educate yourself about, Native rights, sovereignty, self-determination. Get to know a Native person, ask us to lunch, ask us to speak on your panels like you have today, ask us to be on your boards. Also check out Native news outlets like Indian Country Today. That will give you a perspective from the Native point of view on, different issues, including child welfare issues. There's an Indian Child Welfare National Organization that Kimee has done a lot of work for. There's the National Congress of American Indians, also our amazing Department of Interior person now with Deb Haaland. We have the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. There's a lot that you can do to reach out yourself and learn about these organizations and learn about our history, and also meet a real modern day Native American too.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. We do have a question about where you can best sort of learn and educate yourself. And I would like to respond, just to sort of say, the place that I would start is by looking up information that is written by the communities themselves. And that doesn't just go for Native Americans, that goes for any community that you are a part of. Do not pick up a book written by a white person telling you about a particular community. So when you're looking for that information, please be sure to check your authors. And do that research and whatnot before you take Dr. Hallman's advice of meeting a real life modern, Native American or, Black or whatever, gay individual. Because while I am obviously going to let both of them answer if they would like to, it is not necessarily their job to educate you on everything there is to know about being a Native American. And so I just offer the opportunity to do the research yourself, because there are people out there who have written about it and talked about it and whatnot. And so make sure that the onus and the responsibility sits on I'll say our shoulders as white people, to understand more marginalized communities' stigmatization and how systemic racism plays into the day-to-day lives of the individuals that we talk to on Honest Conversation. So with that being said, if there is any additional information that you, Kimee, or Dr. Hallman would like to add, books that you do recommend or talks that you like to share with people, we would love to hear your feedback.
No, I would just echo what you said. And it's important too to recognize too that I can only speak to what I know, my own culture. And I mentioned I'm a Muscogee citizen, but I'm also a Cherokee descendancy. So, and working within that program for 14 years, I got to know a lot of people in the community, and but it's important that, but that you're right, those are outside, even as an indigenous person learning about another community or going in there, it's my responsibility. I don't just show up and ask them a million questions. That's completely inappropriate, and it's almost it's kind of like a slap in the face sometimes. If you're coming to the table to have an honest conversation with us about helping or healing our children and our families, come correct, right? Like, come with the information, and so we can have a good conversation, and it's not just we're not wasting our time where we leave a meeting and we're like, oh, that's an hour of our lives we'll never get back. It's important to have that information and be educated when you come to the table. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, Kimee mentioned this a couple times, but I think the uniqueness of each tribe's history and experience cannot be overstated, because people think, oh, you're a Native American, so you know all about all the tribes, and like, no, I don't. I'm still learning about my own.
Yeah.
And so it's really I think important and respectful to acknowledge and like we said, do your home.
Oh, did we lose her? That's all right. I think she was about to say, do your homework, which is my mom's favorite phrase to me from the age of 5 to 18. So keep that up in your adult life and make sure that you are. Oh, there she is. Is she back? Did we get you? We'll let
We
it
lost you for just as we lost you at do your homework.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Just do your homework and be respectful.
Exactly. I don't see any other questions. And so, oh, here we go. One from Angela. Let's see. How can a program like Stewards or any other program support Indigenous-led action and Indigenous solutions?
Yeah, so I think find out about what's going on in, Native communities with regard to whatever issue it is that, you're talking about. Like Kimee mentioned, there is a lot in terms of trauma-informed practice, things that other communities might consider, very sort of cutting edge. It's like, that's just how we have to do it because, that's who we are. And so, yeah, I think really getting to know what's going on and what is valued in those communities is really the best starting point.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Kimee?
I don't. I think that's right on the mark.
Perfect. I mean, if there is one central theme, one word that I feel like I could take away from today, it is listen. Listen before speaking, listen before suggesting, listen before acting, and quite frankly, make sure that any asset that you are building is a community-based asset, and the origin is from those you are interacting with. And I think that's how to bring in organizations, how to bring support for survivors. It's very much a listening exercise if you are not a member of the community. And I would also add, maybe you're not the person to be there, and that isn't the place for you to be. And it's okay to admit that and to say that and to support other organizations who are the people who are supposed to be there and in those communities. And so, yeah, I am so grateful to both of you for joining us today, for sharing. I know some of the things that you're talking about are probably you've repeated a million times, but I know that the audience who joined us today is very grateful and appreciative that you're willing to share that with us. So thank you so much. And we hope to have you back on Honest Conversations soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care.
The real pleasure.
Bye.